The gala was in full swing, and the room buzzed with that unique kind of energy that only wealth and fame can create. People in tuxedos and evening gowns mingled, glasses of champagne clinking, deep voices talking over soft jazz music in the background. The chandeliers above sparkled like diamonds, reflecting the gold of the polished floors. It was everything you'd expect from a high-profile charity event. But the moment that would change everything happened in the midst of all that grandeur, a seemingly innocent question that stopped everything cold. Keanu Reeves, quietly observing from the corner, hadn't been expecting it. He wasn't one for grand speeches, or for being put on a pedestal, so when a young boy, no older than 12, slipped through the crowd, it was almost as if he was invisible to the people around him. He wasn't wearing a fancy suit or a polished look like everyone else. His clothes were a bit rumpled, and his face was slightly red, as though he had been waiting to say something for a long time but wasn't sure how to go about it. Keanu was casually chatting with a few people, his signature calm demeanor keeping him grounded in a world where most would have been lost to the flashing lights and constant praise. But the boy? He had his eyes set on Keanu from across the room. As soon as their gazes met, Keanu's smile grew warm, the kind that made you feel like you weren't just another face in the crowd. The boy hesitated, and Keanu, ever the kind soul, nodded in his direction. "What's on your mind, kid?" he asked, leaning down so that he could make eye contact with him. The boy's hands were trembling, his small fingers fidgeting with the corner of a napkin, as though he were trying to steady himself. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet, almost lost in the hum of the event. "Sir, how much money do you have?" "Like, a lot of money." He swallowed, his eyes flicking to the crowd, then back at Keanu, his cheeks flushed. "My mom says you're rich, like, really rich. Is that enough to help my family?" Keanu froze for just a second. It wasn't a question he had ever expected, let alone one that came from a kid at a fancy event like this. His smile faded, replaced by a somber, contemplative look as he processed what the boy was really asking. The room seemed to quiet down around them for a brief moment, the contrast between the boy's innocent sincerity and the superficial world of wealth surrounding them almost too stark to ignore. Keanu wasn't one to pull punches, but something about this moment felt different. It was one thing to be asked for money in passing, but this was raw, and there was a weight in the boy's voice that made it impossible to dismiss. The boy wasn't just asking about money, he was asking about the possibility of a better life, of hope, of answers he didn't have. Keanu cleared his throat, standing up a little straighter. He could feel the eyes of the crowd drifting toward them, the whispers beginning, but he didn't care. There was something about this kid, about the innocence, the desperation that pulled him in. He took a deep breath, ready to say something, anything, that might make a difference. "Money isn't always what helps, kid," Keanu finally said, his voice quieter than before but steady. "But the people you have around you, the love you get, that's what really matters. It's not about how much you have, it's about how you use it and what you give back." The boy looked confused, the frown on his face deepening as he tried to grasp the weight of what Keanu was saying. Keanu could see it in his eyes, the question still lingering there, unanswered. The boy's confusion only deepened as Keanu's words hung in the air between them. He shifted uneasily, the napkin still gripped tightly in his hands, and glanced around at the people who seemed to have forgotten that they were standing next to something much more real than the polished surfaces and expensive clothes they wore. His eyes were wide, searching Keanu's face, but the answer he received didn't make the world clearer. The boy wanted something more concrete, something he could hold on to, a tangible promise that everything would be okay. But Keanu's words, though well-meaning, only made the gap between them wider. He could see the boy's mind working, a storm of thoughts spinning behind those youthful eyes. "What do you mean by that?" the boy finally asked, his voice trembling slightly as though trying to piece together a world he had never quite understood. "You have a lot of money, right? Doesn't that mean you could just give me some to help my mom?" I just don't get it." His voice was barely audible now, and Keanu could feel the weight of the question settle deep in his chest, the realization of how little the boy knew about what really mattered in life. Keanu took a step back, his brow furrowing. He had been in enough places to know that money could solve many problems, but it wasn't always the answer. He could see the desperation in the boy's face, the look of someone who had been told for too long that money would make things better, that wealth could fix everything that was broken. And now, this child was staring at him, waiting for a response, hoping for some glimpse of hope that Keanu wasn't sure he could give. "Look, kid," Keanu said, the words coming more slowly now, like they were weighed down with everything he had learned over the years. "Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy the most important stuff. It can't buy love or happiness or the people who truly care about you. Money can't heal broken hearts, and it sure as hell can't fix everything that's wrong in your life. He paused, looking at the boy's face, which was scrunched up in frustration. It was clear he didn't understand, not really. And that frustration, that confusion, it was so raw that Keanu couldn't help but feel the sting of it too. The boy's voice broke through the tension like a sudden storm. So you're telling me that if you had enough money, you wouldn't help people like us? His words were sharp, almost accusing. Keanu could feel the eyes of the room drifting in their direction, and a strange silence seemed to fall over the crowd. The noise of the gala faded, leaving just the two of them standing there, the boy's question hanging like a challenge. Keanu knew the answer he wanted to give. He wanted to say that he would do anything to help people in need, that he had done everything he could with his resources to give back to the world. But in that moment, something about the boy's question, the desperation in it, made him pause. There was no easy way to answer, no neat little phrase that would make everything okay. No, Keanu replied, his voice quiet, more somber than it had been before. That's not what I'm saying at all. But helping people doesn't always come in the form of giving them money. The world's a lot more complicated than that. You can give someone money, sure, but that doesn't always fix their problems. Sometimes, the most important thing you can give is your time. Sometimes it's about showing up, being there for someone when they need it, giving them your ear when they're hurting. Money's easy to give, but real help, real change, takes more than that. The boy's face was a mask of conflict, his brow furrowed, and his lips pressed into a tight line as though trying to make sense of something that was foreign to him. But I don't get it, he muttered, staring down at the floor for a moment, as if looking for some way to make it all fit. We're poor. My mom works all the time, and we barely have enough to eat, let alone get by. How is love or kindness supposed to fix that? He didn't look up as he spoke, as though the weight of the world was in his words, as though the unfairness of his life was more than he could bear. Keanu's heart tightened. He could see the boy's struggle, the disconnect between the world he had grown up in and the one that Keanu had seen. He had no answers that would make it all better, no way to explain that life wasn't as simple as just writing a check and making everything go away. He was starting to realize that the boy wasn't just asking about money, he was asking about hope. And that was something Keanu wasn't sure he had the right answer to either. I know it's hard, Keanu said, his voice softer now, more understanding. I know you don't have all the things you wish you did, and that the world feels heavy sometimes. But I promise you, kid, there's more to life than just the stuff you can buy. You're asking me if money will help your family. But let me ask you this. What are you doing to help your family? He could see the boy's eyes flicker with uncertainty, as though the question had caught him off guard. I'm not saying you need to be a grown-up, but you can still make a difference. If you've got a mom who works all the time, maybe you could help out at home. Maybe you could be the one to make her smile after a long day. Maybe it's about being there for her, showing her that you see her, that you appreciate what she does for you. Maybe that's the kind of change we're talking about. The boy looked at him for a long moment, processing Keanu's words as if they were something new, something he hadn't considered before. The tension in the air between them seemed to ease, but the boy still didn't speak, his eyes locked on Keanu's face, as though waiting for something more. Keanu felt the weight of the conversation hanging between them like an unspoken bond, a silent understanding starting to form. He wasn't sure how the boy would react, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had said something that mattered. Something that wasn't about money or fame or status, but something real. The boy's silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Keanu wasn't sure whether his words had reached him or not. The shift in the boy's expression was subtle, but it was there, his brow furrowed slightly as he stood still, his small body barely moving except for the faint trembling of his hands. Keanu had expected resistance, maybe anger, but the boy's silence felt heavier. There was something else behind those eyes, something Keanu couldn't quite decipher, but it gnawed at him. It was as if the boy were processing everything too quickly, too deeply, for someone his age. His face, still flushed from the weight of their conversation, showed signs of internal conflict. He wasn't sure if Keanu's words had made him feel better, worse, or if he had just given up trying to understand altogether. Finally, after a long pause, the boy looked up at him again, and this time, Keanu noticed the faint shimmer of tears welling in his eyes. The boy bit his lip, as though trying to keep them at bay. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, and yet it carried an undercurrent of pain. You don't get it. You don't understand what it's like to live like I do. You can talk about love and kindness all you want, but that doesn't feed us. That doesn't pay the bills. My mom's been struggling for so long, and no matter how hard she works, nothing ever changes. He wiped his eyes quickly, as though ashamed of the tears threatening to fall, but Keanu had seen enough to know the boy's frustration ran deeper than just this moment. There was a bitterness there, a sense of helplessness that wasn't easily washed away with a few comforting words. Keanu felt his chest tighten at the boy's words. He wasn't angry, but there was a weight in them that he couldn't ignore. The boy was right, to a certain extent. No matter how much Keanu wanted to reassure him, no matter how much he wanted to say that everything would be okay, there was no easy fix for the realities the boy was living. Keanu wasn't some superhero who could just swoop in and make it all better with a smile or a grand gesture. He had lived long enough to know that the world wasn't that simple. But there was something in the boy's voice, something desperate, that made him feel like he had to say something more, something that would make sense of all this. "I get it," Keanu said, his voice calm but firm. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to walk in your shoes. I don't know what it feels like to struggle like you and your mom do. But that doesn't mean I'm going to stop trying to help however I can. It doesn't mean I'm going to pretend I have all the answers, but I'm telling you, the fight you're talking about, the one where you're trying to get by, make ends meet, that's not one you can win alone. It's about the people who stick by you, the ones who keep pushing, even when it feels like everything is stacked against you. I can't fix it for you, but you don't have to fix it alone." The boy shook his head, not in defiance, but in sorrow. "I don't have anyone else. My mom's always working. She's trying, but she's so tired. She doesn't have time for anything else. I'm just a kid. What can I do? How do I make a difference when nothing ever changes?" His voice cracked as he spoke the last few words, and Keanu could see that the boy's frustration had morphed into something much more profound, an exhaustion that had settled deep inside him, a kind of hopelessness that had been building for too long. Keanu felt a tug at his heart. He had been in situations where he felt powerless, where no amount of effort or good intentions could change the course of things. But he had also seen the resilience that could come from the most unexpected places. It was easy for him to talk about love, about showing up for people, but how could he explain to this boy, whose whole life seemed to be about survival, that what mattered most wasn't just material wealth or solving every problem overnight, but the strength to keep going in the face of all that uncertainty? "You're right," Keanu said, his voice softer now, trying to reach the boy, trying to get through to him. "It's not easy. You're right to be frustrated. You're right to feel like nothing's changing, like nothing's fair. But you're not nothing. Just because you're young, just because you're struggling, doesn't mean you don't matter. Sometimes, it's about the little things. Like, maybe you can't change the world in a day, but you can be there for your mom when she comes home tired. You can make sure she knows that you see her, that you're not just waiting for her to fix everything, but that you're there with her through it all." The boy looked at him then, really looked at him, as though considering the possibility for the first time that maybe, just maybe, Keanu's words could mean something. But then the skepticism returned, and his expression hardened again. And what if she doesn't have the strength to keep going? What if she's too tired to even notice? What if I'm just another problem she has to deal with? Keanu didn't have an immediate answer for that. The weight of it hung between them, thick and heavy, but he could see that the boy wasn't asking for easy answers. He wasn't asking for someone to fix things for him. What the boy was really asking for, what Keanu realized, was a reason to keep going. He wasn't looking for charity, he was looking for hope. And that was something that didn't come with money, something that couldn't be bought or given away. It had to be earned, one small step at a time. "I'm not saying it'll be easy," Keanu said, his voice steady, though he was starting to feel the weight of the conversation pressing in on him. "But maybe, just maybe, it starts with believing that even in the toughest times, you don't have to do it alone. You've got more strength in you than you realize. You just have to find it. And sometimes, that's enough to get through." The boy was quiet again, still processing, still unsure. But Keanu could tell something had shifted. He could see the doubt in the boy's eyes, but there was also a flicker of something else, something softer, something more hopeful than before. The walls the boy had built up, the ones that kept him from trusting, from believing, were beginning to crack. Keanu wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing. He had given the boy something real, something he could hold on to, even if just for a moment. And maybe, just maybe, that was the start of something that could change everything. The room felt oddly still as Keanu watched the boy, whose eyes had gone distant, processing the words he'd just spoken. The air seemed to thicken around them, the sounds of the gala continuing just a few feet away, but it was as if everything had blurred into the background. Keanu could see the shift happening in the boy's mind. The tension that had once been in his posture was slowly starting to ease, even if he wasn't fully convinced yet. There was no applause or grand gesture to follow. The change was quieter, more subtle. Keanu wasn't sure how much of an impact his words had truly made, but something in the boy's face told him it was enough to start a change, however small. Then, as if on cue, the boy turned his gaze back to Keanu, his expression unreadable for a moment. There was a flicker of something. Maybe it was hesitation, or maybe it was the beginning of understanding, but it was clear the boy wasn't ready to let go of the conversation just yet. "Do you really think it's that simple?" the boy asked, his voice still tentative, but now laced with something that sounded almost like challenge. He was no longer just asking questions. He was trying to process the depth of what Keanu had said. "You think I can just show up for my mom and things will magically change? That's not how the world works. You don't know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like you don't matter, like you're just a burden on the people you love." His eyes dropped to the ground again, as though he didn't want Keanu to see the vulnerability that was creeping back into his voice. "Maybe you've never been in a place where it feels like nothing you do will ever be enough." Keanu looked at the boy, taking in the weight of what he had said. There was a bitterness there, yes, but there was also truth. The boy wasn't just angry, he was overwhelmed. It wasn't just the hardship he felt, it was the overwhelming sense of being unheard, unseen, like his existence wasn't enough to make a difference in the world. The longer Keanu stood there, listening to the boy's words, the more he realized how little anyone ever really understood what it was like to feel that way. It was easy for people like Keanu, people who had made their names and their wealth, to talk about perseverance and love and family. But for a kid like this, who had already seen the harshness of life at such a young age, those words could feel like hollow promises. The boy's voice trembled slightly, though he tried to mask it with a frown. "You can't just tell me to believe in something better when all I've seen is struggle. I'm not saying I don't want to help my mom, but it's hard to believe that things can change when every day feels like a fight. How do I find the strength to keep going when I feel like I'm already at the end of my rope?" His eyes flicked up to Keanu's face again, but this time there was no anger. Instead, it was something more raw. It was a cry for help, a plea for someone to give him a reason to hold on. Keanu didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure how to respond to the boy's pain, how to give him the hope he so desperately needed. For a brief moment, Keanu found himself in the boy's shoes, remembering the times in his own life when everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers, when he couldn't see a way forward. He had been fortunate enough to have people who believed in him, but not everyone was so lucky. In this boy, he was on his own, or so he believed. But Keanu knew that wasn't entirely true. There were ways to help, even in the smallest ways, and those ways were not always about money or solutions that could be handed over. Sometimes, the most powerful thing was simply being there for someone when they needed it the most. "You're right," Keanu said after a long pause. His voice was steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "It's not easy. I can't tell you that things will magically get better or that showing up every day will suddenly make everything right. But I'm telling you, there's more strength in you than you know. I've seen people in situations just like yours, feeling like they were too small to make a difference. And you know what? They changed their world. Not by giving up, but by showing up. They found the courage to keep going, even when everything around them seemed like it was falling apart." He took a step closer to the boy, his gaze firm but compassionate. "What I'm saying is that you're not alone in this, even if it feels like it. You're stronger than you think. And that strength? It's what you bring to the people around you. Sometimes, the hardest part isn't doing everything all at once. It's showing up, over and over again, even when you don't think you can." The boy didn't say anything for a long time. His face was still a mixture of confusion and frustration, but there was something else there too, a spark, a flicker of something that hadn't been there before. He wasn't sure if he believed Keanu yet, but he was beginning to consider it. He wiped his eyes quickly again, as though trying to keep the tears from falling, but they were there, soft and uncertain, but real. For the first time, Keanu saw that the boy wasn't looking for a quick fix. He wasn't asking for handouts or promises that couldn't be kept. He was asking for the chance to believe that there was something more, that he could find the strength to carry on, even when the weight of the world seemed unbearable. Keanu stood there, giving the boy space to process everything that had been said. He wasn't sure what the boy would do next, but he knew one thing for sure: the conversation had changed both of them. The boy wasn't the same person he had been when he first asked about money. And Keanu, in some strange way, had come to realize that maybe the boy had taught him something too. Sometimes, the greatest gift wasn't giving someone the answers they wanted. It was showing them that they had the strength within themselves to keep fighting, to keep moving forward. Just as Keanu began to think the conversation was coming to an end, The boy looked up at him again, his face softer now, his expression thoughtful. "You really believe that, don't you?" he asked, his voice quieter, but with a new sense of resolve. Keanu nodded, his own heart a little lighter than it had been before. "I do," Keanu said simply, and for the first time, he felt like his words might be enough. The boy stood there for a moment, his eyes fixed on Keanu, a mixture of uncertainty and hope flickering in his gaze. The air between them felt different now, less tense, like the heavy weight of expectation had lifted, replaced by something more subtle. It was a small shift, but one that made all the difference. Keanu could see that the boy wasn't fully convinced yet, but there was a spark there that hadn't been there before. He wasn't the same child who had walked up to him, desperate for answers, confused by the complexities of the world around him. And Keanu wasn't the same man who had offered up words of advice, unsure of how they would land. They had both changed, even if just a little, and that was enough. After a few moments of silence, the boy finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before, but steady. I think I understand a little more now," he said, his eyes still searching Keanu's face. There was a pause, as if he were weighing the words before he spoke them. "I'm not sure how to change everything, or if I can, but I think I can at least try. I'll try to show up for my mom, even if it's just in small ways. Maybe I can help her feel like she's not alone." The words were simple, but they held a new weight now, as though the boy had made a decision, not just about what he wanted, but about who he was going to be moving forward. It wasn't a promise that everything would suddenly get better, but it was a promise to try, to not give up on the people he cared about, and to find the strength in himself that Keanu had shown him was there all along. Keanu smiled, his heart lifting with the boy's words. It wasn't about grand gestures or fixing everything all at once. It was about taking that first step, about choosing to keep going even when the path was unclear. "That's all anyone can do," Keanu said, his voice calm, but filled with genuine pride. "You don't have to have all the answers, kid. Sometimes, the most important thing is just showing up, day after day, and doing what you can with what you've got." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle for a moment. "And I believe in you. I can see it in you. You've got the strength to make it through, even when it feels impossible." The boy looked up at him then, his eyes no longer filled with the same frustration or confusion, but with something softer, something that hinted at the beginnings of belief. It was a fragile thing, that belief, but it was there, and it was growing. Keanu could see that, even if the boy didn't fully realize it yet. The boy gave a small nod, his lips curling into a faint, tentative smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, things could begin to change. As Keanu turned to leave, he glanced back at the boy one last time, watching him for a moment as he stood there, his small figure still a little lost in the crowd, but with a new sense of purpose in his step. The boy wasn't alone anymore, not in the way he had been before. He had a piece of something now, something to hold on to, something that would carry him through the days ahead, even if the road was still long. Keanu knew that he wouldn't be there to see the boy's journey through, but he didn't need to be. What mattered wasn't that Keanu had given him all the answers, but that, in that brief moment, he had shown him that there was something worth fighting for, that, despite everything, the boy wasn't invisible. He mattered, and he always had. The sounds of the gala slowly returned to Keanu's ears, the chatter, the music, the clinking of glasses. But for the first time that night, it didn't feel so hollow. The weight of the boy's question had settled deep in his chest, and the answer wasn't about money or fame or anything external. It was about finding the strength to keep going when the world seemed dark, about showing up, even when it felt like nothing would change. Keanu didn't know if the boy would remember their conversation in a week or a month, but he knew one thing for sure. He had given him something that no amount of wealth could provide, a belief in his own strength, a sense of purpose, and the knowledge that even when life felt overwhelming, he didn't have to face it alone. As Keanu made his way through the crowd, people still greeted him, still smiled at him, but the weight of their words and their glances didn't seem to matter so much anymore. He had just witnessed something that was far more important than all the accolades and praise in the world. He had seen a boy, a young soul, on the brink of discovering his own worth. And that, Keanu realized, was more meaningful than anything else. Sometimes, the greatest change didn't come from giving someone everything they wanted. It came from showing them that they had the power to change their own world. And in that moment, he realized that the boy had just taken the first step. It wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of something far more valuable than either of them could have predicted.